All right, welcome back. This is section 3 in module 3. We're going to be talking about the late Bronze Age, the wealth and the collapse, also the big trade network that has a pretty significant collapse by the end of it. It's going to kind of clarify this Bronze Age for you, and I want to make sure that we kind of orient you with the dates in question here. So 1550 corresponds to the New Kingdom in Egypt. Beginning, the New Kingdom is also about 200 years after Hammurabi, if you want to kind of think of it in terms of Mesopotamia. It's kind of a sense of where we're at in terms of the timeline. So try and keep those dates a little bit straight. I don't ask you many dates at all, but I usually will let you know if one needs to be remembered for the quiz. But hopefully that kind of helps you remember. Now let's talk about what we need to say. So late Bronze and early Iron Age and so on. So archaeologists in ancient history use predominantly metal for weapons and tools, and this helps us organize our discussions on the basis of a chronology. And so that's kind of the parameters for the discussion. So the Bronze Age runs from about 1200 BC, and it covers everything that we've covered so far, right? And then the Iron Age runs from about 1200 to 500 BC. And that's what we're going to be talking about in the next couple of lectures. So bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, and so iron is obviously just iron. So it'll make you kind of familiar what archaeologists mean by that, obviously. But we are further subdivided into early, middle, and late, because you're talking about 2,000 years, and it's not that helpful unless you kind of subdivide it. So what we're really talking about today is about 1550 to about 1177, which is the late Bronze Age. And I said, yeah, it was 1177, which is kind of a good date, easy to remember. And it's based on the work of Eric Klein, who has a really good book on the topic. And for the purpose of broad chronology, that's what you kind of need to know as far as the Bronze Age, Iron Age crossover. But most of the time we use about 1200 BC as a nice round number. Simple truth is that there's a 23-year difference doesn't mean much in the grand scheme of things. People didn't wake up one day and go, oh my gosh, Bronze Age has collapsed. What age are we in now? I don't think that that's how it worked. And well, Jerry, I think it's the Iron Age, right? It's actually good that we had these two different dates because it gives us this transition time. Sometimes we're too rigid, like, okay, we wake up one day and then next day it's a whole different time in human history. So if we look at the late Bronze Age, there's a number of thriving cultures, some here that we've already talked about, like Egypt and Hatti, where the Hittites are. We have Babylon. We're going to talk about in the next lecture. We have Greece and Assyria. In the next couple lectures, we're going to talk about them and a number of coastal cities. And we're going to look at the part of this map here that talks about Greece. Akajawa is what the Hittite term for it, but it's ancient Greece. And all these groups are connected through a really big trade network. And it basically is the Eastern Mediterranean, ancient Near East trade network that is going on during the late Bronze Age. And business is really booming during this time. We see the wealth in their tombs. We see the wealth in their grave goods, gold, ivory, glass. There's all sorts of things that say, man, there's a lot of wealth flowing in this region during this time period in particular. And this here is an artist's reconstruction of an archaeological ruins of the palace at Pylos in Greece. And you can see they have different fragments of different paints and all this stuff. And it's very, elaborate. They found marble there. And so it's just kind of a reconstruction to kind of give you a visual for how splendid this place was. And I mean, you can see that if you were able to visit there, you'd be impressed by the wealth of the king who's in charge of this. And it's just one example of the wealth that comes out of Greece. If we go back to the map here and look at Greece as an outlier, right? I mean, it's considerably further west than the rest of these places, but it's still a big part of the trade network. And this really needs to be included also, this little tiny island here, which is called Cyprus, because you get a lot of wood from there. So then we go back to Egypt, and what we see in the artistic record in terms of Egypt backs up what we've been saying. This is the tomb of Rekhmire, an official from the 18th dynasty. He's showing all the different people and different groups that bring in trade goods. We have Nubians, right? We have from Cyprus and Crete. We have those islands in the Aegean, basically the Greeks, and they're bringing in some really cool looking vessels. It's really fancy, unique objects as the Egyptians don't really normally see, right? But if you look really close up, you see some nice pots. There's a giraffe, some exotic animals, a jaguar, a leopard, so on. So that means that we've got places in Africa, the Aegean, they're all coming to Egypt. We have animal skins, leopard skins. It's really an era of globalization, and I'm not saying global in terms of like, yeah, the Americas, but even India and China have goods that have showed up in the Mediterranean during this time frame. So it really is kind of this big globalized trade network. If we go back to what we said about Thutmose III, we could bring up the Battle of Megiddo. Thutmose wins a great victory, creates over a coalition of city-state rulers. The Egyptian Empire is basically born in Syria and Palestine and Western Asia. And the reason he wants to control Megiddo is it's on a hill, it's elevated, you can see the trade routes. There's modern roads there that kind of are basically built right on top of the ancient roads. There's a valley all the way back. It's very lush, very productive, and Thutmose wants to control that valley and the trade routes that go through it, and that's why he captures the city and why Megiddo continues to be important in human history, right? Like we said, there was a battle in World War I. If you fast forward a couple thousand years, the Battle of Armageddon in the book of Revelation, that's Megiddo, Armageddon. So the graphic, reality behind the truth is that the trade network was central to Thutmose's goal. And it's really about that era of globalization, controlling the trade route, and you're going to make a ton of profit from that. The Amarna letters are another topic we've already talked about, and they also reflect this era of globalization. And this lecture is kind of a lot of review of some of the other stuff, but if you kind of go back when we get to the exam, this would be a really good lecture to come back and watch because it kind of hits a lot of this stuff. So the Amarna letters, we have thousands of letters from the vassals of Pharaoh Akhenaten. We have about 350 survived from all different people and all different groups. The letters tell us about the turmoil that's developing, and in this era of globalization, as you know, it's going to be tough when you have a big empire trying to control all of it. You have city-states, and they each have their own mayors and whatever you want to call them, and they're saying, hey, Pharaoh, you're too spread out. We need some help. So we know that, even in most of these places in Syria and Palestine, you see a lot of Egyptian gold, lapis lazuli, and you know that we have silver coming out of Egypt and going into Egypt, and lots of trade of very wealthy luxury goods during this time of trade. Archaeologically, though, by far the most interesting thing is the Kos shipwreck. Yeah, underwater archaeology is pretty cool. But the Kos shipwreck is pretty awesome, a bit of data during this time. I kind of nerd out with stuff like this because it's awesome. We have pottery, vases, jars from all over the region.
Joey, come to the office.
Sorry about that. Each region has typically had its own distinct pottery, and they decorate it in a certain way, and we have different costumes associated with each culture and even food, right? Powder, we can see trace of seeds in the pots and figure out what they're eating. It's an incredible, incredible thing. And it really does kind of give you this sense to show, how extensive the trade network is. On the Kos ship room, they found 10 tons of copper, and that's worth like millions today. It's still really valuable for wiring and stuff like that. You need copper to make bronze, right? So that makes sense. So they also found tin, which makes sense. There's gold, ivory, ebony, luxury goods coming from Africa. There's wood, which is from Lebanon. There's raw glass from Mesopotamia. It weighs another couple of tons. 6, 7, 8 cultures are represented from different trade periods. We have scarabs from Egypt, okay? You can see this. This is a little scarab from Egypt with the king's name on it. They would stamp it in wet clay and then kind of go and put it into the scarab. You have a Mesopotamian cylinder seal, if you remember, where they would roll out and stamp their name. There's wooden writing tablets that had wax in them, which are obviously now lost, to the ocean, but the wax is still there, and kind of that idea of that ancient eraser. And so you have really cool evidence of this global network. These are copper ingots. It's just raw copper. It's green because it's oxidized, and they don't look big, but you're talking about, these are about the size of a sheet of poster board. I mean, they're very, very big. We have glass in raw ingots, right? Really beautiful vessels that survived even today at the bottom of the Mediterranean here. And so what makes this thing fall apart, right? Well, invasions, migrations, or maybe both, right? Like, what's the difference? Well, invasions involve war. Migrations are kind of done during peaceful times. But these cities over here are being attacked, right? With lots of war. You have the Dorians invading Greece. The Libyans attacked Egypt. The Thracians moved into what was the Hittite Empire. And you have a lot of people moving, and we don't have a 100% explanation for it. Some people say it's got to be climate related, there's got to be natural disasters happening, but lots of things can kind of affect why people move and where they move. We know there were dry phases and droughts, and also that was kind of a big deal in the ancient world. But these empires are really kind of moving around. These empires are moving this way, conquering, migrating, invading. And it kind of gives you an idea that it's no longer just stable. Something is pushing these people out of Greece and Europe and this area into the Middle East, the ancient Near East here. So we have trouble brewing, right? And I think it's a perfectly, kind of a perfect storm of factors that's going to basically collapse the globalized trade network of the late Bronze Age. There's earthquakes, invasions, like we talked about, climate stuff. There's decline in the empires, and you add all this up, and it's more than it can really bear. There's other historical events and consequences that are developing. Egypt and the Hittites are both in decline. Sites all over the Near East are being destroyed. Famine, contact, and stuff like that that characterize trade, they're dying out. So the system collapses. And at the same time, I think it's really interesting. We have new people showing up, nations, that are kind of establishing themselves. We have Israel, right? You have the Philistines, Eden, Moab, Phoenicia, and these places emerge as their own states during this upheaval time, the collapse of the empires. So what happens during collapse? Well, you have opportunities, and that kind of depends on your perspective, I guess. But Egypt would say it's a collapse. The Israelites would say, hey, it's an opportunity. We have a chance to really kind of step it up. We don't really know everything that happened, but we know that there was definitely a system collapse that happened during this time, and it crumbles under the weight of all of those pressures, and you kind of need to know that for quiz and test purposes. You have the importation of different pottery that happens, so we know that a lot of pottery is coming out of Greece at the time, and it's really tough for these people to recover. And so that kind of wraps up this lecture, and that gets us to the Iron Age, and we will pick back up in the next lecture. Thanks.